Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 41 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for this series, we've been getting to know Tolkien's circle of literary friends, the Inklings, a bit better, and we've been using Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book to help us out. Now, last time, we looked at Tolkien's Mythopoeia and the importance of the dying god myths to Lewis's conversion. Today, though, we're going to move forward quite a bit in the book to a point where Charles Williams has joined the Inklings, and we're going to see the differing opinions that Lewis and Tolkien had of him. For this, we're moving from part 1 of Carpenter's book, where we looked at each of the first 4 chapters, all the way to part 3. But first, we're going to look at how Williams got involved in the Inklings. In April of 1939, a review of Williams' first volume of his Arthurian poetry cycle, Taliesin through Logres, appeared in Theology. By the way, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not a big Charles Williams guy, so it's very possible that I missed that, but I'm sure I will be corrected if that's the case. That review, interestingly enough, was by C.S. Lewis, who would end up really being captivated by Williams, as Carpenter says. Now, Williams would come to visit Lewis at Magdalen, but more often, Lewis would go to London, and the two would meet up at Williams' favorite lunch spot. Now, Williams had also been complimentary of Lewis's work, referring to The Allegory of Love as one of the most important critical books of our time. Now, later, in September of 1939, Williams moved to Oxford to work at the University Press. Carpenter adds that no sooner had Williams arrived in Oxford than Lewis persuaded him to join the group that met in his Magdalen rooms to read their work in progress aloud to each other, the group that Tolkien called our literary club of practicing poets, the Inklings. They generally met on Thursday evenings during the university term and sometimes during vacation. But by November of 1939, Williams had become a regular member. Now, even though Williams would write to his wife that the Inklings are good for my mind, they weren't exactly important to him, as Carpenter explains. All his ideas had been developed long before he had come to Oxford, and the thing that occupied his imagination chiefly at the present time, the composition of more poems for Taliesin, was a private task to which the Inklings could not contribute. It was true that he did read some of his Taliesin verse aloud on Thursday nights, but everybody except Lewis found it incomprehensible. Williams would later write to a friend, "No one of a vivid brain ever talks to me about them, or at least no one in the way I like. CSL admires them and alludes to them, but..." Okay, now that we've got that through, how did Tolkien view this newcomer to the Inklings? According to Carpenter, Tolkien was, at the start at any rate, a bit suspicious of him. He writes, "The first thing Tolkien knew about Williams was Lewis declaring that he had made the acquaintance of a most marvelous person, and that he, Tolkien, would undoubtedly love Williams as soon as he met him. The most generous-hearted person would have been a little suspicious of this, and Tolkien responded by becoming faintly jealous. Lewis's friendship meant very much to him, and he did not altogether care for the sudden arrival of Williams at a high place in Lewis's affections." Now, Williams really did have a high place. In many cases, it seemed a bit like hero worship. Carpenter tells us that Lewis told a friend, "If you were going up the high street in a bus and saw Charles Williams walking along the pavement among a crowd of people, you would immediately single him out because he looked godlike, rather like an angel." That friend had in fact actually seen Williams from a bus and said, "To my eyes, he looked like a clerk or a craftsman in a small line of business, perhaps a joiner or a carpenter, but I thought there was nothing godlike or angelic about him." Carpenter writes, Tolkien would have agreed. He liked Williams, but he did not regard him as even remotely angelic. Okay, but really, who amongst us is? Now, Tolkien, in letter number 276, wrote of Williams, "I knew him only as a friend of CSL, whom I met in his company when, owing to the war, he spent much of his time in Oxford. We liked one another and enjoyed talking, mostly in jest, but we had nothing to say to one another at deeper or higher levels. I doubt if he had read anything of mine then available. I had read or heard a good deal of his work, but found it wholly alien, and sometimes very distasteful, occasionally ridiculous." Now, Tolkien explained that this wasn't so much a criticism of Williams, but rather a demonstration of his own limits of sympathy. Nevertheless, he concluded with the simple statement, "I remained entirely unmoved." That's not to say that the two men didn't get along or didn't enjoy one another's company. To the contrary, Carpenter writes, they often drank beer together, especially in the Eagle and Child, a favorite haunt of Lewis and his friends, which was generally known as the Bird and Baby. "Had a glass in half an hour at the B&B with Charles Williams," Tolkien noted one Tuesday morning, Tuesday being the day on which the Inklings had taken to gathering at lunchtime in that pub, and such meetings between him and Williams were frequent. Now, I don't like leaving this up in the air, as it were, but that's the end of Tolkien Tuesdays for Series 5. Now, we will read more about Tolkien and the Inklings on some future Tolkien Tuesdays for sure. I just don't yet know what I'll be covering for Tolkien Tuesdays in Series 6. But join me the week of May 20th to find out. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what it is I talk about. You can also support the show, get an ad-free feed, and bonus episodes and all sorts of good stuff. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.